The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from North Carolina.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.Res. 892 as amended, calling on the government of the Republic of Rwanda to release Paul Rusesabagina on humanitarian grounds.
Without objection,
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
the gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.Res. 892, which calls on the release of Paul Rusesabagina on humanitarian grounds. First, I would like to thank my colleague, Chairman Castro, for drafting this important measure. Nearly 30 years ago, Paul Rusesabagina, a Belgian citizen and a permanent resident of the United States, risked his life to protect more than 1,000 people during the 1994 Rwanda genocide. In honor of his singular and valiant actions during one of the worst human rights crises and mass murders in history, he was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In August 2020, Paul Rusesabagina boarded a plane in the UAE that he believed was headed to Burundi, only to arrive in the capital of Rwanda and be arrested by Rwandan authorities under dubious terrorism-related charges. In September, despite a lack of due process and fair trial, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He had been placed in solitary confinement and charged with numerous crimes of no credence. The Rwandan government's unlawful actions, including the extrajudicial transfer of Mr. Rusesabagina from the UAE to Rwanda and his deteriorating medical condition while detained, are of great concern. The Department of State has now determined that he was wrongfully detained pursuant to the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act. As such, this resolution calls for the immediate release and return of Mr. Rusesabagina on humanitarian grounds. We urge the administration to raise the case of Mr. Rusesabagina in all interactions with the Rwandan government and continue to press for his immediate release on humanitarian grounds. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of House Resolution 892, calling for the release of Paul Rusesabagina on humanitarian grounds. And I'm proud to co-lead this resolution alongside Representative Castro. Thank you for your leadership. Paul Rusesabagina is a legal permanent resident of the United States who was awarded Presidential Medal of Freedom for his heroic actions during the Rwandan genocide. In August 2020, he was extrajudicially transferred from Texas to Kigali, Rwanda, by way of the United Arab Emirates and subjected to an enforced disappearance for 3 days before the government of the Republic of Rwanda acknowledged his detention. He underwent trial proceedings for terrorism-related charges, and the American Bar Association has subsequently determined that his fair trial rights have been violated. Pursuant to the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage-Taking Act, the Department of State has determined that Mr. Rusesabagina was wrongfully detained. I urge the Rwandan government to urgently work with the State Department and authorities in Europe to secure a path forward for his release and return to the United States. It is also critically important the government of Rwanda grant access to his US-based doctor to assess his health and well-being. I urge my colleagues to support this important resolution and efforts to bring Rusesabagina home to his family. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
I yield 5 minutes to the representative from Texas, the chair of the Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact, the Honorable Joaquin Castro.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to urge my colleagues to support House Resolution 892, calling on the government of the Republic of Rwanda to release Paul Rusesabagina on humanitarian grounds. Paul is a hero of the Rwandan genocide and a permanent resident of San Antonio, Texas, my hometown, where his family also lives today. Last year, a Rwandan court sentenced Paul to 25 years in prison on politically motivated charges. Paul is 68 years old, and for him, that's a life sentence. Congresswoman Young Kim and I have been closely following this case for several years, and we were proud to introduce House Resolution 892 in February of this year. Paul's story begins in Rwanda, the country of his birth. Nearly 3 decades ago, he was serving as assistant general manager of a luxury hotel in Kigali, Rwanda, when the Rwandan genocide began. The genocide, which led to the deaths of an estimated 800,000 people over a 3-month period, targeted mostly members of the ethnic Tutsi minority. Paul is a member of the Hutu majority, but he was determined not to see his Tutsi countrymen die on his watch. As genocidal killing squads roamed through Rwanda, Paul sheltered more than 1,200 people in his hotel, saving their lives. In the aftermath of the genocide, Paul and his family received asylum in Belgium and later moved to San Antonio with the help of the late Texas Senator Bob Kruger, an international leader in the fight against genocide. In 2005, President George W. Bush presented Paul with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, our nation's highest civilian honor. Since the 1994 genocide, the government of Rwanda has made tremendous strides in economic development and stability. However, the country's government is still plagued by corruption, abuse of power, and human rights issues that amount to violations of international law, including enforced disappearances. At home and abroad, Paul Rusesabagina has used his voice and elevated platform to call attention to the need for change in Rwanda. In response, the Rwandan government launched an extraordinary campaign of persecution against him. In August 2020, Paul was extrajudicially transferred from Texas to Rwanda by way of the United Arab Emirates and arrested on trumped-up charges. The Rwandan government did not acknowledge his detention for 3 days, during which he was reportedly subject to torture. In September 2021, Paul was found guilty and sentenced in a trial that the European Union described as, quote, marred by numerous violations of his fair trial rights. He's a cancer survivor who lives with serious cardiovascular issues, and Rwandan authorities have not provided him with the care he needs in prison. I have my children here on the floor with me, and my heart breaks for Paul's family, who can only speak to him once a week for 5 minutes. It's long past time for Rwanda to release Paul and allow him to come home to San Antonio. My colleagues and I on both sides of the aisle have raised our concerns previously. In December 2020, we sent a bipartisan bicameral letter to Rwandan President Paul Kagame, urging him to release Paul on humanitarian grounds. We spoke out about the way Paul was taken against his will to Rwanda, which for all intents and purposes was a kidnapping by the Kagame regime. In June 2021, my colleagues and I wrote to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, urging him to use all diplomatic means at his disposal to ensure Paul's safe return to the United States. And we're not the only ones who are concerned. Last year, the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights issued a report that found that Paul's right to confidential communication, his right to the presumption of innocence, and his right to prepare his defense have all been violated. And in October 2021, the European Parliament adopted a resolution denouncing Paul's illegal arrest. The resolution strongly condemns the conviction, which it said was, quote, exemplary of the human rights violations in Rwanda. Paul is a permanent resident of the United States, and we must work just as hard as our European allies to bring him home. In May, the State Department announced its determination that Paul was, quote, wrongfully detained, noting that the determination took into account the totality of the circumstances, notably the lack of fair trial guarantees in his trial. I appreciate the support of the State Department, which has been working with Paul's family and Congress on this issue. And I'm especially pleased that Paul's case is now under the purview of the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Ambassador Roger Carstens. Rwanda's President Kagame wants to be seen as a global leader and a reliable partner of the United States, including on issues including climate change. But Paul's unlawful detention is a blight on Rwanda's international reputation. I urge my colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, to support this resolution.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution offered by Representative Castro and myself. And I want to recognize Paul's family, especially his wife and children, who have tirelessly advocated for his release. And I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentlewoman from California yields. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the purpose of closing.
You are recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Paul Rusesabagina's history and circumstances as a war hero wrongfully detained and denied adequate medical care is one that we cannot ignore. Congress must stand with Paul Rusesabagina's family, who have not wavered in championing his legacy and calling attention to his plight, to call for his immediate release and return to the United States on humanitarian grounds. I again thank Chairman Castro for his leadership on this resolution, and I urge all my colleagues to join us by voting in the affirmative. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 892? As amended, those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, this is a gentleman from Texas seek recognition.
I request the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the chair declares the House in recess until approximately 6:30 p.m. today.